always thought there was a quiet kind of strength in being patient, in holding things together without anyone noticing the cracks. But no one tells you what happens when your silence becomes a license for others to forget you're even there. It was a Sunday afternoon when I finally saw it for what it was. David's birthday. 45 years old, and Margaret insisted on throwing a party like he was a boy turning 10. The house smelled of overcooked meat and the cheap cologne David insisted on wearing. Dozens of guests crammed into our living room, laughing, drinking, slapping each other's backs as if they were the ones who had held David up through the years. As if they had any idea. I stood by the kitchen doorway, wiping my hands on the faded apron Margaret had bought me 5 Christmases ago. She said it suited me, all beige and dull, like I was supposed to be grateful for blending in. My feet ached from standing since morning, preparing the food David liked, the ones Margaret said were the only things that made her son's life tolerable. I smiled when the guests complimented the roast and nodded when they asked for refills. Nobody ever asked if I'd sat down. I hadn't. Then it happened. Margaret clinked her glass, Chardonnay, her favorite, and the room quieted. She stood up, tall and brittle like one of those dried flowers she kept in vases all over the house. "Everyone, I just want to say how proud I am of my son," she announced. "He's worked so hard to get where he is today. Partner at the firm. A man people respect. And I'm sure you all agree with me when I say David deserves all the credit for this beautiful home, this wonderful life." The room erupted in applause. People turned to look at David, raising their glasses, their smiles wide. My husband gave a practiced grin, pretending to be modest. "I couldn't have done it without my mother," he said, his voice smooth like he'd rehearsed it in front of the mirror. "And my team at work. And of course, Margaret for raising me to be the man I am today." His eyes flicked toward me then, barely a glance. "And Olivia, for, making sure the house runs smoothly. I don't know why I expected anything else. I don't know why it stung so much when I'd long since grown numb. I felt the heat rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I was good at that. Swallowing things down." After the toast, Margaret pulled me aside into the kitchen. "Next time," she said, tapping a chipped fingernail on the counter, "don't overcook the potatoes. David likes them softer. You know that." She didn't thank me. She didn't even look me in the eye. She just walked back out, leaving her perfume hanging thick in the air. I stood there, staring at the pot I'd been scrubbing. My reflection stared back at me in the cloudy water. Hair tied back, circles under my eyes that no concealer could hide, hands rough from years of bleach and soap. I was 38. I didn't recognize myself. Later, when the party had thinned out and David's friends had gone home with their wives clinging to their arms, I found myself on the balcony. Alone. The stars were out, but they looked dim from here. David came out, drink in hand, and stood next to me like we were the picture of a happy couple. "Big day," he said. "Thanks for making it nice." I wanted to ask him if he really believed that was enough, if he ever thought about what I wanted. But the words stuck to the roof of my mouth, bitter and sharp. Instead, I nodded. "Of course," I said. "That's what I'm here for." He didn't hear the hollow ring in my voice. Or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. He took a long sip from his glass and stared out at the dark yard. "Mom thinks we should renovate the kitchen," he added. "More space for you to work in." I smiled then. Not because I was happy, but because it was the only thing I could do without falling apart. "That sounds great," I lied. Inside, Margaret was already collecting the leftover cake, packaging it neatly to give to her church friends. She caught my eye and tilted her head. "You're lucky, she said. "David could have married anyone, but he chose you. He needs someone who knows her place." I didn't answer. I watched her wrap the cake, watched her fingers tie the ribbon like it was the easiest thing in the world. And maybe for her, it was. That night, after I cleaned the dishes and wiped down the counters, I lay in bed beside David, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above us. His breathing deepened, steady in sleep, while I stayed awake, listening to the silence press in around me. I thought about the years I had given to this house, to this family. The dreams I had tucked away neatly like folded linens. The job I'd left to raise our son. The nights I soothed fevers while David worked late or didn't come home at all. The times I held Margaret's hand when she was sick and scared, only for her to later dismiss me as nothing more than the help. I wondered how I had let it get this far. How I had become so invisible in a life I had helped build. And that was the night I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. I was more than this. And something had to change. I don't remember when I stopped hoping things would get better. Maybe it was after Ethan was born, when David didn't even hold my hand during the delivery. I was exhausted, drenched in sweat and tears, but when they placed our son in my arms, I looked around for him. He wasn't there. He had stepped outside to take a phone call. Margaret said he was working hard for us. That he had to answer, even at that moment. I believed her. Back then, I believed a lot of things. I believed that if I worked hard enough, loved hard enough, they would see me. That if I put David first, he would do the same for me. That if I made Margaret comfortable, she might one day call me her daughter instead of that girl. But people like Margaret don't change. They tell you who they are from the beginning, you just refuse to listen. I still remember our first real conversation. David had brought me to the house to meet her. I was young, maybe 23, and still thought my love for him would shield me from everything. She looked me up and down like she was measuring furniture. Then she smiled, tight, controlled. "You'll do," she said. "For now." It wasn't until years later I understood what she meant. That I was never going to be enough, no matter what I did. But back then, I thought if I kept smiling, if I stayed polite, she would soften. Instead, she moved into our home after her husband died, and my life became one long routine of disappearing. I didn't even notice it happening at first. It was small things. Margaret started redecorating. Said the curtains I chose were too dark, the couch too plain. She picked things she liked, pale blues, heavy florals, and I told myself it was fine. She was grieving. It was just furniture. Then it was the meals. She insisted on cooking for David some nights. "He's used to my food," she told me. "It's what makes him happy." So I let her. And then I stopped cooking altogether on those nights because David started complimenting her meals more than mine. Soon, it wasn't just meals and curtains. It was the way David looked past me when she was in the room. The way he started asking her opinion before mine on everything from Ethan's school to the color of the car we leased. I went from being his wife to someone who just happened to live there. And Ethan. God, I tried so hard with him. I wanted to be the mother who made everything feel safe. But kids notice things even when you think they don't. He was 6 when he first started going to Margaret before me. He'd fall and scrape his knee, and instead of running to me like he used to, he'd look for her. She'd kneel down, tell him he was brave, give him candy she wasn't supposed to let him have. She told him I worried too much. That I was too strict. I wanted to tell her that I was trying to keep him healthy, trying to protect him. But she'd look at me with that smug little smile, like I was just an obstacle in her way. And David, well, David said, "Mom's just helping. You don't have to make everything a fight." I learned not to make things a fight. I learned to smile even when my chest felt hollow. I became good at smoothing things over, at pretending their words didn't bruise me in places no one could see. But inside, I was shrinking. There were days I barely recognized my own voice. I stopped talking to my friends from before. They didn't understand. They said I should stand up for myself, but they didn't see how it was. Margaret had a way of making me feel like I was the problem. David had a way of making me feel like I was lucky to be there at all. I remember one night, Ethan had a fever. A bad one. It was past midnight, and I was holding a cold cloth to his head, sitting beside him in bed. David didn't wake up. Margaret stood at the doorway, arms crossed. She told me I was coddling him too much. That when David was a boy, she let him tough it out. "That's why he's strong," she said. "You're making Ethan weak." I wanted to scream at her. Instead, I just rocked Ethan gently until he finally fell asleep. That night, I stood in the hallway after Margaret had gone back to her room, and I cried quietly so no one would hear. I realized something then. That I had no one. No one to tell me I was doing okay. No one to tell me it was going to be alright. And when you're alone like that long enough, you start to think maybe you deserve it. Maybe they're right. I'd given up painting, something I loved since I was a teenager. My canvases were stored in the basement now, stacked against each other collecting dust. Margaret once told me it was a childish hobby, and David said we didn't have room for my projects. So I let it go. I let everything go. But lately, something has started to crack. I see it when I look in the mirror. I see it in the way my hands tremble sometimes when Margaret tells me I'm not good enough, or when David shrugs me off. There's something in me that isn't numb anymore. It's raw, angry, awake. I'm not sure when it began, but I know this much: I'm starting to remember who I was before them. Before I became invisible. And I'm not sure how much longer I can keep pretending I'm not here. The thing about silence is that, after a while, you start hearing things you didn't notice before. Tiny sounds. The faint hum of resentment building under your skin. The whisper of your own name as you repeat it quietly in the dark, just to remind yourself that you're still here. I used to think I could live like this forever, being the quiet one, the understanding one, the one who keeps things from falling apart. But something inside me had changed. And once it started, I couldn't stop it. It was small at first. A shift. I started saying no to things. Little things. Margaret asked me to fetch her slippers one night after dinner. She was sitting in the living room, feet up, while David scrolled through his phone. "Olivia," she said, like I was a maid, "be a dear and get my slippers from upstairs." I almost did. I was halfway to the staircase when I stopped. I stood there for a moment, fingers twitching at my side, feeling the old habit tug at me. But I turned around and looked her straight in the eye. "I'm busy," I said. That was it. Just 2 words. But they tasted like freedom on my tongue. She stared at me as if I'd slapped her. David didn't even look up. The next morning, Margaret was colder than usual. She criticized the way I made the eggs. Said they were too runny. Then she, accidentally, spilled her coffee on the blouse I'd ironed the night before. I didn't react. I cleared the dishes. Cleaned the stain. But inside, something twisted tighter. I was keeping count now. Every small cruelty. Every glance that dismissed me. Every comment designed to shrink me down a little smaller. I saw it all clearly, like someone had pulled back a curtain I hadn't realized was there. David was no better. He'd come home late and say he was working, but I could smell perfume on his collar that wasn't mine. Sweet, floral, too young for him. I asked him once. Just once. "Where were you tonight?" His answer was a sigh. Heavy, annoyed. "I was working late." Don't start. And that was it. No explanation. No comfort. Just dismissal, like I was a child asking stupid questions. I didn't ask again, but I knew. I wasn't a fool. I think I stopped being a fool years ago. I just didn't want to admit it. What made it worse was Ethan. He was pulling away from me, little by little. Margaret was in his ear constantly. "Your mother's too soft," she'd say. "You need to be tougher if you're going to be a Thompson." As if being a Thompson was something to be proud of. As if it wasn't just another word for control. One afternoon, I found them in the study. Margaret was helping him with his homework. She praised him when he got answers right, but when I came in to offer him a snack, she waved me off. "He doesn't need junk food," she snapped. "He needs to focus." Ethan didn't even look at me. He just kept his eyes on his workbook. And my heart broke in a way I didn't think was possible anymore. But it did. Later that night, when Ethan was asleep, I opened the old cedar chest in the attic. Inside were my paintings. The ones I had hidden away. Dust clung to the edges, but the colors were still bright underneath. I traced the lines with my fingers. It felt like touching a ghost of who I used to be. I pulled one out. A portrait. A woman sitting by a window, light streaming over her face. She looked hopeful. Young. I had painted her before I married David. Before Margaret moved in. Before I forgot who I was. I held the painting close and whispered, "I remember you." And I swore I saw her eyes soften, like she remembered me too. I don't know exactly when the decision formed in my mind, but by morning, I knew what I had to do. It wasn't enough to say no. It wasn't enough to stand still. I had to leave. I had to save what was left of me. I sat at the kitchen table, waiting for David. When he came in, I said it quietly. "I want a divorce." The words didn't shake. My voice was steady, calm. It surprised me how easy it was to say it once I'd decided. David blinked at me, confused for a second, like he didn't understand the language I was speaking. Then his face darkened. "Don't be ridiculous," he said. "You wouldn't survive a week without me." But that wasn't true anymore. I saw it clearly. He needed me more than I needed him. And he knew it. Margaret, when she found out, was worse. "You're throwing away everything we built," she hissed, her face tight with rage. "After everything I did for you." And that was when I laughed. I couldn't help it. I laughed because it was absurd. She hadn't done anything for me. She had taken and taken until there was almost nothing left. But not anymore. I was taking myself back. I packed a small bag. Just the essentials. And the painting. The woman and the light. I didn't tell Ethan yet. Not because I didn't love him, but because I needed to be strong first. I needed to be sure. David tried to stop me at the door. He grabbed my arm. "You walk out that door, Olivia, and you're dead to me." I looked at his hand, then back at him. "Then I guess you've already buried me," I said. And I walked out. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. I just kept walking. Every step felt heavy and light all at once, like shedding skin that had suffocated me for too long. But I wasn't done yet. There was still something they didn't know. A secret that would change everything. And they were about to find out just how wrong they had been about me. Leaving the house should have felt like freedom. For a few days, it did. I stayed in a small apartment on the edge of town, one I paid for with the money I had stashed away over the years, bits and pieces I'd scraped together from the grocery budget and birthday money David gave me like I was a child getting an allowance. I told myself it wasn't stealing. It was survival. And it was mine. The apartment wasn't much. A studio with a view of a cracked parking lot, peeling wallpaper, and a leaky faucet I had to jiggle every time I wanted water. But it was quiet. Quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. At night, I slept with the window open and listened to the wind instead of Margaret's footsteps creaking down the hall. I woke up without dread pooling in my stomach, wondering what criticism would be waiting for me at breakfast. I breathed. For the first time in years, I breathed. But peace is never free. And David wasn't a man who took being left lightly. The first call came 3 days after I left. I let it go to voicemail. His voice was tight, forced calm. "Olivia, we need to talk. You've made your point. Come home." The second message wasn't as polite. "You're embarrassing me. This isn't how adults handle things." By the fifth message, he was shouting. "If you don't come back, I'll make sure you regret this." I listened to them all once, then deleted them. But the sixth message wasn't from David. It was Margaret. "You ungrateful little girl," she hissed. "After everything we gave you. After everything I did for you. You're going to destroy this family. But mark my words, Olivia, you won't win. You never did." I didn't answer. I didn't call back. But I knew it wasn't over. It wasn't in their nature to let me go. On the 7th day, I found David waiting by my car when I left the apartment. He was dressed for work, his tie perfectly knotted, his suit crisp. But there was something wild in his eyes. Something I recognized. The same look he had when he broke a golf club over his knee the day he didn't make partners soon enough. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm giving you a chance," he said. "Come home, and we can pretend this never happened." I looked at him, this man I had once loved, and felt nothing. "I'm not coming back," I said. "And I don't need your permission." His face changed then. Hardened. "You think you can make it out there? You think anyone's going to want you? You're nobody without me." He didn't yell. He didn't have to. His words had always been knives sharpened in whispers. I didn't flinch. "Maybe," I said. "But I'd rather be nobody on my own terms than nobody in your house." I stepped around him and drove away, my hands shaking only a little as I gripped the wheel. But I knew it wasn't over. I was waiting for it. And it came. A week later, I was served with papers. David was suing for full custody of Ethan. The grounds. He claimed I was unstable. That I had abandoned my family. That I was unfit to be a mother. The words blurred together on the page as I sat at the kitchen counter in my apartment, reading them over and over. Margaret's fingerprints were all over it. Her lawyer. Her strategy. I could almost hear her voice coaching him through it. "She's emotional," she would say. "She can't be trusted. She never could." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something, break something. But I didn't. Instead, I opened the drawer of the old desk in the corner and pulled out a file I had kept hidden for years. Copies of documents. Letters. Things Margaret and David never thought I'd kept. But I had. Because somewhere inside me, even when I was drowning in their control, I knew I might need them. The truth. The secret they had buried so deep they thought it was gone. I remembered the day I found it. Margaret was sick. It was 2 years after Ethan was born. She had a fever, and I was bringing her water when I found her half asleep in the study, papers scattered across the floor. I knelt to gather them, and there it was. A birth certificate. Ethan's birth certificate. But it wasn't the one we had. It listed another name under father. Not David Thompson. Someone else. A name I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I found the letter tucked beneath it. Margaret's handwriting, sharp and precise. Instructions to David. Telling him what to do. How to handle it. Ethan wasn't David's son. He never was. Margaret had paid off the hospital clerk to change the records, to make it seem like Ethan was David's. Because she couldn't stand the scandal. Because she couldn't stand her son being humiliated. David knew. He knew all along. And he stayed. Not because he loved me. But because he was afraid of what people would say. Afraid of losing his perfect image. Margaret had orchestrated it. Controlled it. Controlled us all. And now they were using Ethan against me. As if he were a weapon. As if he were theirs to wield. But they didn't get to use him anymore. Not after what they did. I placed the file on the table and stared at it. My hands were steady now. I was steady. I called my lawyer. I told him everything. I sent him the documents. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This changes everything." And it did. David and Margaret thought they held all the cards. They thought they could crush me like they always had. But they forgot one thing. I had the truth. And the truth was about to destroy them. The day of the hearing was colder than it should have been for spring. The kind of cold that slips through your coat and settles in your bones no matter how tightly you wrap yourself. I remember sitting on the wooden bench outside the courtroom, my fingers curled around a cup of coffee I didn't really want. I watched the steam curl upward and disappear. And for a moment, I wondered if that's what I had been all these years, something invisible, something disappearing into nothing. But not today. I was here. I was solid. And I wasn't the one on trial, even if they had tried to make me believe I was. David arrived first. His suit was flawless, his tie straight, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He walked in with the same confidence he always had, the kind that came from knowing the world would bend to him if he pushed hard enough. He didn't look at me at first. He greeted his lawyer, shook his hand, adjusted his cuffs. But I could feel the heat of his glance eventually, flickering over me like a threat unspoken. He still thought he had control. He still thought this was his game. Margaret came in right after, moving like a storm cloud in pearls and gray wool. Her face was set in that same expression she'd worn the day I married David, a mix of pity and superiority, like she already knew I was destined to fail. She didn't sit. She stood next to David, resting her hand on his shoulder like she was steadying him. But I knew better. She was steadying herself. The hearing began with David's lawyer painting me as the villain. I was unstable, they said. Neglectful. They brought up the fact that I had left the family home, that I had taken time away from Ethan. They twisted facts and turned silence into guilt. I sat still through all of it, my hands folded in my lap, feeling their words bounce off the wall I had built inside myself. I didn't speak. I didn't flinch. Because I knew my moment was coming. When it was my lawyer's turn, he stood with quiet assurance. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply laid out the truth. Document by document, letter by letter. He told the court the real story of Ethan's birth, how David wasn't his father, how Margaret had paid to cover it up, how they had used me as their shield, their puppet, keeping me quiet and under control so their secret would stay buried. I watched David's face as the words sank in around him, as if the ground beneath his feet was cracking wide open. Margaret's grip on his shoulder tightened. Her lips pulled thin, bloodless. The judge asked questions. My lawyer answered them all. Clear. Precise. And then they asked David. He hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. Is this true? The judge asked. His mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. Then he said, "It's not relevant." But it was. And everyone in that room knew it. I didn't look at Margaret. I didn't need to. I could feel her fury twisting the air between us, but it didn't touch me anymore. She was scrambling for control, and it was slipping through her fingers. For once, she couldn't silence me. For once, her money and power weren't enough. The judge ruled in my favor. Sole custody, full rights, and a protective order to keep them away from Ethan and me until further notice. I expected to feel triumphant, to feel something sharp and powerful. But what I felt instead was quiet, deep and still. Like the world had finally stopped spinning out of control, and I could breathe again. David stormed out first, his lawyer chasing after him. Margaret lingered. She walked slowly toward me, each step deliberate. For a moment, I wondered if she might apologize. If some part of her might soften, just once. But she didn't. She stood in front of me, her chin lifted. "You've ruined us," she said. "No," I replied. "You did that to yourselves." She stared at me for a long time, and then she turned and walked away, her shoulders stiff, as if she still carried all the weight she had tried to lay on me. When I left the courthouse, I found Ethan waiting outside. I had asked my sister to bring him. He stood there, clutching his backpack, his eyes wide and uncertain. For a moment, I was afraid he wouldn't come to me. That Margaret's poison had seeped too deep. But he did. He ran to me, wrapped his arms around my waist and held tight. "Are we okay now, Mom?" he asked, his voice muffled against my coat. I closed my eyes. "Yeah, baby," I whispered. "We're okay now." We spent that evening in the apartment, eating takeout on the floor because we didn't have a table yet. He told me about school. About his favorite teacher. About the boy who sat next to him who always forgot his lunch. He was just a kid. My kid. And for the first time, he felt like mine again. Not a pawn. Not a weapon. Just my son. Later, after he went to bed, I pulled out my easel from the corner. I set up one of my old canvases. I wasn't sure what I was going to paint yet, but it didn't matter. The brush felt good in my hand. The blank space in front of me was filled with possibility. David and Margaret thought they could break me. That I was nothing without them. But they were wrong. I was never theirs to ruin. And now, they had to live with the truth. Alone. Some mornings I still wake up before the sun. Old habits don't disappear easily. For years I trained myself to rise early, to prepare breakfast before anyone else stirred, to make everything perfect before they opened their eyes. But now when I wake, it isn't out of fear. I lie in bed, listening to the quiet hum of my new life. The apartment is still small, but it's ours. Ethan's breathing from his room is soft and steady, like the ocean when the tide is calm. And I don't rush out of bed anymore. I take my time. Sometimes I close my eyes again and let myself drift, not into sleep, but into the warmth of knowing I am safe. Safe from them. Safe from who I used to be. After everything that happened in court, after David and Margaret lost, they tried to disappear. David sent an email 2 weeks after the ruling. One sentence. "You got what you wanted." That was all. No apology. No explanation. I never expected either. Margaret never contacted me again. But I heard things. People talk in this town. David was quietly demoted, then left the firm altogether. Margaret withdrew from her charities, her clubs. Word was, her name didn't hold the same weight it once did. Without the image of a perfect family to parade around, they both faded into something smaller, something bitter. And maybe they blamed me. Maybe they spent their days spinning stories about how I betrayed them. But I didn't care. I had stopped carrying the weight of their judgment. I had stopped caring if they ever understood. It was a strange feeling at first, being free. I didn't recognize it. The absence of their voices in my head left behind an echo I wasn't sure how to fill. So I started small. I painted. Every day. Sometimes I didn't even know what I was painting until it was done. Colors I hadn't used in years spilled out of me like they'd been waiting all this time for permission. Some pieces were soft, full of light. Others were darker, rougher, full of edges I hadn't let myself explore before. It didn't matter. It was mine. I sold one painting to a woman at the local gallery. She said it made her feel hopeful. I stood there staring at the empty space on the wall where it had hung and realized I felt hopeful too. Ethan changed in ways I hadn't expected. At first, he was quiet, like he was waiting for the ground to shift under his feet again. But slowly, he relaxed. He smiled more. He started drawing with me sometimes. Little sketches, messy and joyful. He told me once that he liked the quiet here, that it felt better than the old house. I asked him if he missed his father. He shrugged. Not really, he said. And then he added, "You're enough, Mom." And I believed him. We made new routines. Saturday mornings at the park. Ice cream after dinner. Movies where we laughed so hard we cried. Nothing grand. Nothing perfect. Just ours. And in that simplicity, I found a peace I didn't think I deserved for so long. But I did. I do. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset from our small balcony, Ethan leaned his head on my shoulder. He was quiet for a long time, then asked, "Do you think Dad and Grandma miss us?" I thought about lying. About saying something soft, but I had promised myself no more lies. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe. But sometimes people miss things for the wrong reasons." He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. More than I realized. I kept the painting of the woman in the light. I hung it by my bed. Some days I look at it and wonder how I ever let her fade. But she's here now. We're here now. Stronger. Brighter. Not waiting for anyone to give us permission to exist. One day, I got a letter from the gallery owner. She wanted to host a solo show of my work. My first thought was to say no. It felt too big, too fast. But then I thought of all the years I had spent hiding. All the years I had been told I wasn't enough, that my work was childish, that my dreams were silly. And I said yes. Because this life I was building, it wasn't about them anymore. It was about me. And Ethan. And the future we were carving out with our own hands. The night of the show, I stood in that small gallery surrounded by strangers admiring my paintings. I didn't feel nervous. I felt seen. Not as David's wife. Not as Margaret's disappointment. As Olivia. Just Olivia. A woman who had rebuilt her life from ashes they thought she'd choke on. Ethan was there too, holding my hand when the crowd got too loud, smiling up at me like I was someone worth celebrating. When we got home that night, I tucked him into bed and sat on the balcony alone for a while. The stars were out, clear, bright, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I made a wish. Not for love, not for forgiveness, but for more of this. More quiet joy. More mornings where I woke up free. More evenings where I painted until I lost track of time. Margaret and David would never know this version of me. And that was fine. They had their chance. They threw it away. I wasn't their ghost anymore. I was alive. And I was never going back. I stood up, stretched, and went inside. Tomorrow was another day. A good one. One I chose. And that was everything.